What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Pentiment, Obsidian's recently released narrative game, based on 16th century Bavaria. But before we get into that, a few things I do have to mention at the beginning of the video here. For starters, I did get a review copy of this via Microsoft, though I got it the day before the game was going to launch, more specifically like 5 or 6 hours before it launched. But nonetheless, there's that disclosure for you. Secondly, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on YouTube, which does include the achievements, but also a lot more than that. If you're not subscribed to the channel and you go to the channel page, first thing you're going to see is a video explaining everything that I cover, and my Steam profile is public and linked in the description below. And last but not least, pronunciation is not a strong suit of mine, especially from languages I am not familiar with, so I am almost definitely going to mispronounce several things here, so sorry for that up front. Now, with no further ado, let's actually dive into this thing and talk about it a little bit. First thing you need to understand about Pentiment is that this is a narrative game, and while Obsidian is known for their deep RPGs with choice and consequence, etc., narrative games are often seen as visual novels, choose-your-own-adventure books, but video game style, that kind of thing, though I personally tend to refer to them as narrative games. So with that said, understand that this is a story being told to you, and you're interacting with it and making decisions, etc., but there's nothing like combat or exploration in the traditional sense. And the game is primarily the story. So as we move into the story setup section of this video, I want to mention that I'm going to try to keep this as spoiler-free as possible. So I'm going to give the basic setup and talk about a few things and my thoughts. And then I'm going to have a more spoiler-heavy section where I talk about a few specific things I want to mention. Though if you don't want this game spoiled for you because this kind of game is the story, I would just skip the story sections altogether. But I should have them timestamped down below so it's easy to navigate. Jumping into the first part of this, we play as Andreas Mahler, who is investigating a series of murders in a Bavarian town that I believe is called Tassing, in 16th century Bavaria, of course. Though it's worth mentioning that these series of murders take place over 25 years, so a significant amount of time will be passing, which means that a lot of the decisions and choices you make do have some pretty far-reaching consequences. For the most part, I would tell you the story itself is very engrossing. This is one that I had a hard time putting down before I had finished my first run of it, which ran, for me, about 15 hours. And the vast majority of that is incredibly well written with a ton of choice and consequence, which is really exemplified in two different things. For starters, as I mentioned, the game takes place over 25 years, and a lot of your decisions will affect the later parts of the game by, who's around, who's not, how people react to you based on the decisions you made previously, the kind of normal stuff you would, for the most part, expect. In addition to this, though, we see the occasional persuasion option. Based on how you talk to people and the responses you pick, you can sort of gain or lose favor with them, which isn't something you really see as a metric anywhere, it's just sort of in the background. But every once in a while, when you need to, say, convince a certain character to do something, whether or not that persuasion is successful is based on a few different things, a lot of which has to do with how you've been interacting with people and how you've been investigating these murders. So it's something you will have an impact on without explicitly being aware of the things that are going to affect that decision the first time through. Though when it happens, you will see a bit of a screen pop up that kind of tells you whether or not it was failed or passed and the things you did that were associated with the decision, which I think is a pretty cool way to handle it, that both shows you why that choice is happening and adding some weight to the things you do. And while that's pretty cool overall, I did want to mention that the game does drag in a couple of places. The start is a little slow while it's explaining mechanics and setting up all the characters, that kind of thing. In order to be done well, that takes a little time, which for me made the first couple hours of the game drag just a little bit, and then later in the game, there does seem to be a lot of repetition in the sense that people are explaining things that you kind of already knew repeatedly, which I imagine comes down to the fact that you could have investigated things differently, that kind of thing. But overall, the story is incredibly well written, and a lot of the dialogue felt very realistic and human in some cases, in a way that often reminded me of my own community coming together in the face of a tragedy at times, which honestly hit a little close to home in some cases. From there, let's talk a little bit about the more spoilery section section of the story that I do want to mention. So again, if you don't want spoilers, go ahead and skip past this. And with no further ado, spoilers. So as you're investigating these murders and who could have possibly done it, who had motive, that kind of thing, all of the potential murderers will have notes with them that sort of remind them of something that the person who died harmed them in some way, which seems to imply that while the individual murders were not committed by the person writing the notes, they certainly instigated the murders. So someone's setting this up. And the plot sort of uses this as a reason to justify your choices in many ways, to make it where there's not really a wrong choice, but there's not really a right one either, because these people are being pushed to murder them, and you're never really told one way or the other who explicitly murdered each person, which I thought was a really interesting way to handle it, because whoever the investigation seems to turn on, if you will, is kind of just implied to have been the murderer, which I mention because that's a really cool thing for a narrative game to do, because it sort of sets you up to, again, make all these choices and investigations and, who you think could have done this, which keeps you engaged while, again, there not really being a wrong answer per se, just rather choices in the way they play out, with the broader goal of finding, who's actually pushing these people to be murderers. But that's the end of the story section and the spoilers, so let's move on to some more general information about the game overall. While we do, of course, play as a set character, we do get to pick their background and thus their knowledge a little bit, and as the story progresses, you get to pick one or two more as well, but these options are going to help you with certain avenues of investigation. They will make various activities easier in many cases, or grant you knowledge about a specific thing, and in some cases, having specific backgrounds or skills will help you greatly with a persuasion check that we talked about earlier. But if you skip past the story section, persuasion attempts are the culmination of your choices and interactions with certain people when you need to convince them to do something. And depending on your actions up to that point, the persuasion is either successful or it fails. Backgrounds do play a pretty decent role in how these things pan out. And also it makes you feel a little more attached to your particular version of the protagonist. In addition to this, our investigation of these murders is somewhat structured into various time segments. There is not a timer ticking away per se, however, you won't be able to do everything. Days are passing, and each individual task or investigation, if you will, into a particular thing might cost you some time. And in this way, it's not possible to do literally everything in one playthrough, but you can take your time and choose which things to investigate at your own leisure, which is an interesting way to handle it, again, in the context of this narrative game. Now, at various meal times, you'll have to sit down and have a meal with various characters, which I liked quite a bit because, again, it makes you feel part of the community. And you can get various people's opinions on the goings-on and the situation in town around the murders, learn information even, all while getting a feel for how these people lived, which makes the setting and the town that you're exploring feel as much a part of the story and a character in the story as you or any of the actual characters are. And while you're exploring and investigating and doing all this, you will run into the occasional minigame. They are very simple. They are not designed to really be frustrating or anything, but they do crop up occasionally, and every once in a while there are small puzzles that are very easy to solve, as most of the gameplay revolves around running around, talking to people, following up on leads, getting more information, which of course is primarily done through text. And when it comes to text, as I'm sure you've seen on screen, one of the defining features of this game is its fonts and accessibility options. At the very beginning of the game, you can pick between the stylized fonts or simplified fonts. For people who might have trouble deciphering all the fonts, they have a lot of accessibility options, text-to-speech, scaling for the fonts themselves so they blow up a little bigger, as the written word and the visual style of the written word are a big part of this game. In fact, so much so that the fonts and things that you see on screen are directly representative of your character's thoughts and interpretations of the person that you are seeing. For instance, when you're talking to less educated people, they might make a lot of mistakes in their dialogue in the font as it's written that will then be corrected afterwards. You can also see things like the ink fade and then get darker, where theoretically someone is dipping their quill to get more ink on it. When someone's saying something with emotion, words will have extra little ink splatters around them, or they'll shake. And they do all this really interesting visual stuff with these fonts that convey a ton of meaning through a very interesting medium. And I spend so much time explaining this because it is probably one of the most unique things about this game, and overall I'm a fan. I thought it was a really cool idea. But from there, let's move on to Steam Deck compatibility, and then we'll start wrapping this thing up. So the Steam Deck version of this game plays incredibly well, no surprise there. A game like this is basically just you moving around the screen and talking to people. The game comes with controller support. I think it would have been more shocking if this game performed badly on the Steam Deck, as this is the kind of game that particular piece of hardware plays exceptionally well, which is aided along by the features already baked into the game and the relatively low intensive nature of the game itself. But in case you are wondering, yes, the game plays great on Steam Deck. It has a great on Steam Deck rating for Steam as well. No surprises all around. But from there, let's talk positives, negatives, and wrap this thing up. So positives for me are the story, the accessibility, and the cool stuff they did with fonts. Overall, I loved the narrative, very cool story. I would tell you that in the end, I guessed correctly, but I was wrong about the how, which I enjoyed a great deal. Had a lot of twists and turns, choice and consequences, things you could influence. I very much so enjoyed the tale that was told here, and all of the research that was poured into making this game feel authentic is very welcome. It was very cool. And obviously anything that makes a game more accessible to people, like increasing fonts and easy things that can be done like that, are always a welcome addition to any game. Now, on the negative side of things, while the story is very good, I think it drags in a few places a little unnecessarily. At the beginning of the game, this is to set up all the characters and everything, so I understand, but then in the late game, there's a part where you're just getting a lot of information repeated to you, which goes on for some time. I realize they're probably trying to give you perspectives on it from the townsfolk, but it felt very unnecessary. And then the only other negative I really have for this one was the journal. It was clunky and the UI was very busy. I realized they were probably trying to replicate an actual journal with the turning of pages and all that, but the way it's laid out feels very odd. The UI around moving around your journal was frustrating, and overall it was a consistent pain point that pulled me out of the story. But if they cleaned up the UI on this a little bit and made it a little easier to use, I think it would be great, because you do need to use it. There's tons of glossary terms, etc., that will explain various bits of the story to you, or specific terms, things like that. But that's about as deep as the negatives go for me. So let's move on to our conclusion. While I don't think Pentiment is going to change anyone's mind about this particular genre, as this is a pretty niche genre, let's be honest. While I personally enjoy it, outside of like Disco Elysium, games like this really don't see a ton of widespread appeal. And while Pentiment is a fantastic version or example of this genre, I don't think it's going to make a lot of people change their minds about it. I think a lot of people aren't going to like this purely because they don't like this kind of game, which is a tiny bit unfortunate, because Pentiment is a fantastic example of what this style of game can really be and what it can bring and the way it can push forward narratives and storytelling using really unique mediums like fonts, of all things. And while this is very clearly a passion project, I do think it's also worth mentioning in the conclusion here that you can get it via Game Pass. So if you have Game Pass, you can just play it on there for free. But if you're on Steam, it'll cost you $20. Though a game like this largely exists because of services like Game Pass. I think if Game Pass wasn't a thing, this game probably never would have been made. So even if what I've said throughout this review doesn't sound like your cup of tea, I would recommend trying it out through Game Pass if you have that service, because it's pretty much risk-free at that point. And while in some ways it is like reading a book, it's definitely worth your time. So it gets a buy from me if you like this genre, but it's certainly not going to be for everybody. I enjoyed it quite a bit though. And that, guys, is all I've got for you today. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. We are getting exceptionally close to 100K, which I obviously couldn't do without you watching this video right now. So truly, thank you so much. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.